everybody. This is your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you tonight?
I'm doing okay. It's been a busy time. We took an unplanned for hiatus to catch up on some stuff we had to in our lives, work-wise. But here we are, back again, and I'm all excited to share some stories. Tonight we're going to talk about werewolves.
Oh, that's got to have a silver lining.
Well, maybe not. So I have to tell you, I've always been fascinated with the concept that human beings could in some way metamorph into animals with the cunning of a human and the speed and the agility and what have you, and sometimes the ruthlessness of an animal. There are some really cool stories here in Pennsylvania, believe it or not, of this. And I came across my very first werewolf story in PA actually when I was about 17. And I was reading some historical documents. Yep, I was nerdy even back then. And I found these legends from the Erie Indians. And they were about this panther man, a were-panther, if you will, that would stalk their villages and kill people. And that they kind of lived in fear of him, and it would come out from time to time, periodically. It wasn't a constant, but every so many years it would come out, and they would start to lose children and isolated people who were walking through the woods alone and stuff like that. And I just thought that was a fascinating story. And I've always had an interest in werewolves. There's something very primeval about them. And every culture seems to have its version of these stories. You know, ancient Greece had these stories. All of Europe has those stories. Africa, Asia, everywhere. And we're going to talk about a little bit of those types of stories. Of course, the premier dude in the were community would be the werewolf itself. And, you know, recently, within the last 20 or 30 years, we've also introduced a new character who is not exactly a werewolf because he's not a shapeshifter, but a dog man. So he might fall into this category at the very end. But let's talk a little bit about how far back werewolves go. So there's a disease that people have. It's very, very rare, and it certainly does not explain all of these sightings, called lycanthropy. It is a disease where a person believes they're a werewolf and therefore they act like a werewolf, murdering people, eating flesh, things like that. There is an actual parallel, though, in Native American culture, and that's the skinwalker who craves human flesh. And it was a very similar storyline for how one gets to be a skinwalker or a werewolf. So the story is about a place called Lycaon in ancient Greece, and there was a man there who was a cannibal and turned into a wolf. And this is where the common term lycanthropy comes from. It references back to the beast of Lycaon, who was the first known werewolf, a place where they claim not only was there a person who was murdering and even cannibalistic, but also who had the ability to shapeshift. Herodias, he's from ancient Rome, also wrote about the Nori, who were werewolves, and they turned into wolves every 9 years, and then they would go on a murdering spree. All over Europe, it was believed that werewolves were created in league with Satan. Like they would make a pact with the devil, kind of like witchcraft, and therefore they would become werewolves, and that others were cursed to become werewolves. There are some really interesting stories from that time period, the 14, 15, and 1600s. There was a family by the name of Gandelin who were in France, and they were believed to be werewolves. The story goes that there was a young man and his sister, and they were basically kind of stealing fruit from an orchard. And the boy was up in a tree, and she was down on the ground when her brother looked down, probably to toss her some of the forbidden fruit, and saw this great big wolf coming in her direction, lunging at her. He jumped down and tried to protect her from the wolf, which was attacking her. The wolf then turned its ire on him. He's trying to kill it, stabbing at it, beating at it with his hands, can't get it off. People hear the screaming and come running, and somebody stabs it with a knife, at which point the werewolf releases the boy, but he's already mortally wounded, and takes off. The boy would live for a few days before he would die, and he would tell people that the wolf had the hands of a man, which is interesting because what ends up happening is that it's not a man who becomes the possible werewolf. So there's a young lady in the area, her name's Pernette, and she suddenly turns up the day after this werewolf attack or this wolf attack with an injury in exactly the same area where the man thought he had stabbed the werewolf or the wolf the day before. Same kind of stab wound. So when she turns up with this, she is immediately accused, because there's the old legend that if you're a werewolf and you're injured, you will go back to being a human, and that you'll bear the injuries that you got as a werewolf. They'll still be on your body as an identifier, if you will, and that you still take time to heal. So she is, there was a gentleman in the area who was one of the magistrates, and he was also a witch hunter. So for him, this was just, food for fun. He decided to call the girl a werewolf. He had her executed, and then he went after her whole family, the father, the brothers, the aunts, and some of them confessed to witchcraft. Some of them said that they were werewolves. Some of them absolutely refused to talk. And of course, no matter what you said, you were killed as a werewolf. So the whole family was accused. One of them said that he had been given a salve by Satan that he would rub on himself, and it would make him into a wolf. There are stories like this all through ancient Europe of a salve or a skin or a pelt that you would place over your body that would then magically turn you into it. They're all over Europe. So in Norway, we come across a prince from Belarus who seemed to have the ability to move at incredible speed. He was documented as having been seen shifting into a wolf, and he was eventually stalked and destroyed. There's an area in Gauvain, France, which is called the Beast of Gauvain, and it's an area where a werewolf attacked over 80 people and killed most of them. He was eventually hunted down as a wolf and killed, and according to the legends, he turned into a human as he died, which again, that's exactly how these stories always seem to work out. And then we go around to the rest of the world. I'd like to talk a little bit about not just the wolves, but the others. So, like I said, all around the world, there are were-animal legends. In Finland, they don't have werewolf stories. They have were-bear stories. And their story is, interestingly enough, now remember, these cultures weren't intermixing all the time. There wasn't any internet to read about, and there weren't huge amounts of books on the subject like there are today. So here's what I find interesting is even if these cultures are very separate, like Africa to Finland to something like that, and in that time frame, the story of how one becomes one and how one acts as one seem to remain fairly consistent. So in Finland, they believe that the shamans or the local witch doctors, through a series of magical spells, could take a shirt made of bear skin, and it was called a barzark, and you would put it on, and it would turn you into a werebear, and you would be this ravaging thing that would kill people. Now, interestingly enough, you might like to know that the barzark is actually where we get the word berserk.
My mind already went there. Yeah.
Did it? Yeah. I figure because usually you and I track in a lot of the same ways. In Egypt, it was believed that dead bodies could be dug up to use for magic, and using fat from these dead bodies rubbed on your body and a magical incantation, you could turn into a jackal, a were-jackal, if you would. In Guatemala and Honduras, the Nawals were evil, shape-shifting women who preyed on husbands. I don't know why they picked just that one, but and they would come in the size and in the shape of a great dog or a coyote. And they were, again, these women would perform some sort of magical act using animal fats and skins, and then become these creatures and then kill their husbands for whatever the reason. And in Africa, the belief in lions and leopard men was so powerful. Again, the same thing, skins and animal fat and incantations and herbs and what have you being used. And it was such a powerful belief in Africa that magicians would use it as a threat on their enemies. And there was an elixir called the Borfima, which was made out of the intestines of a victim of a werewolf attack, that would turn a person, or a were-leopard attack, excuse me, it would turn a person into another person into a were-leopard. So you would find a victim of one of the were-leopard attacks, you would follow this process, and you could make yourself one as well. This was so prevalent up through the 1950s and 60s that there were areas where the white colonists and certain African settlers wouldn't go, because they believed that these creatures were inhabiting that area, and they didn't want to anger them. But we're not talking just 1600s. I'm up to the 50s and 60s. And in China, there was a belief in were-foxes. This was interesting because this one's a little bit different. And you find this in China and in Japan as well. The different name, but it comes out to basically the same thing. That there was a human who was being incredibly beautiful, and this person was actually a were-animal, a were-fox. It would shift shape, and the only way you could tell it was a were-animal was when it was in its human form. It would not reflect its reflection on a pool of water or a mirror.
There's that silver connection.
Yep, there's that silver connection. And even in England, there are strange creature stories about were-sheep. 16 and 1700s, there were stories of these demonic were-sheep, which makes a lot of sense because that would have been one of the prevalent animals in their area. That would be this evil animal that would actually harm people. And they're literally all over. You could go all around the world and you can find these colloquialized versions of these were-animals.
It's interesting that all of the geographical regions you mention, though, that the were-animal would be a local species.
Yeah, and I mean, that makes sense to a large extent because they would know the animal that they feared the most. But the fact, and I think that there's an element of it that is just that. It is just that fear of whatever it was. Wolves were terrifying. You know, in Africa, lions and leopards probably carried exactly that same fear. And, you know, if you didn't have wolves, then foxes and coyotes would be terrifying because they would be an apex predator in that area. But beyond that, though, it's interesting that the formula for doing it is so similar. You know, there's very little variation on it. Most of them required an animal skin, fats of an animal or fats of a victim, and incantations and certain herbs and what have you. Some of them also required the pact with the devil, but not all of them by any means. And as you're going down through history, you know, you come across a lot of them. There's, of course, Peter Straub, who was probably one of the most famous. He lived in Bedburg, Germany in 1590. He literally murdered dozens upon dozens of people. He was a young boy, not all that old at all, like in his late teens. And it was said that he made a pact with the devil, that he enjoyed doing this, that he would take the shape of a beast and kill men, women, and children. He would later confess and say that the devil came to him and gave him a girdle which would transform him into a wolf whenever desired. He was not caught for a long time, Like, he killed dozens and dozens of people, and eventually he was hunted down, and he was most probably one of the true lycanthropics, because he truly believed himself to be a wolf. He incriminated himself over and over again, and always insisting that he went in the guise of a wolf and then, killed his victims. And he was interesting because he's also the only person to ever, that we know of in history, who truly believed himself to be a lycanthropic or a wolf, who also would rape. You don't see that anywhere else in history. And he had killed 13 women, 13 children, 2 pregnant women. And he had indeed eaten their flesh. There was no question. Pieces of their belongings were found with him. But he's a fascinating character because he really did embody a lot of that terror. And maybe it was because he was not a very important person, and this caught his madness. But he honestly believed until he was executed that he was. And you can go down through history. I could probably find you 200 such stories out throughout history. But I wanted to get into some of the more modern ones now, because I think some of them are really interesting. And, it's easy to say, oh, it was a long time ago. These people were superstitious. There's no reason to believe this today. Nobody sees this stuff today. But that's not true at all. So let's get into those. Perhaps one of the most famous ones is the Beast of Bray Road in Wisconsin. So if you've been around the stories of werewolves for any length of time, you will very quickly come across the stories of the Beast of Bray Road. This came into popularity probably the early 1980s. The story was that there was this creature, this animal creature, that on Bray Road in a rural Wisconsin area, and it was seen by many, many people. And probably the first official Bray Road sighting was in 1991. So it was late in the evening, late afternoon, early evening, and this woman was driving home when she claimed that she saw something moving from left to right, and it smacked into her right tire. She stopped the car, like looking out to see what she hit. She thought probably it was a deer or something. I mean, you're driving in a rural area.
Mm-hmm.
It's 8:30, 9 o'clock at night. It's most likely what you would think you were going to see. And this thing, whatever it was, rose up off the road. And she described it as a dark, hairy creature with a bulked out chest, and it ran towards her car like it had been thrown a little forward. She had just literally stepped out of her car to see what was going on with this thing. I don't know why. I would never have gotten out at night to do this, but she was, so she jumps into the car and tries to speed away. The thing lunges, and as she's trying to get past it, it latches onto the trunk, and she's swinging the car around trying to get it to stop, and it finally falls off. Later, she gets to her house. She calls a friend. She's hysterical. And the friend's like, look, you had to have hallucinated this. You saw a dog. You saw something, right? They go back, and sure enough, there's these horrible scratches on the back of her car. And when they get there, they both claim they saw this creature kind of laying along the edge of the road, almost like it was wounded and trying to rest. But when it saw the car stop, it got up and shambled into the woods. At that point, nobody was getting out of the car to go after it. So they took off, and then they kept their secret for quite a while. Then there was a newspaper reporter for a local newspaper who got wind of that story, and began to take a little look, okay? And she began to uncover other stories. A lady by the name of Lorraine Andreezy, who in 1989 was driving down Bray Road. She had an encounter with what she thought was a person hunched up at the edge of the road. But when she slowed down, thinking it was a person who was injured, it was nighttime, the figure stood up. He was well over 6 feet tall. And as she stopped there, because she was going to say, are you okay? It looked human enough in the dark that she thought somebody might have gotten hit by a car or was injured. It stood up and came at her from the passenger side. She described it as being covered in grayish fur with large fangs and pointed ears, and a long snout. That's another encounter. Now, near that area, a few weeks later, a dairy farmer named Scott Bray found a strange-looking dog going across his pasture. He's watching it. It's moving. He thought at first it was a large German Shepherd. This is daylight sighting now. And it had, then it stood up on its back legs and took off running even faster. And he described it as having a hairy tail, long, scraggly, grayish black hair, and pointed ears and a snout. And he described that it had a real strong chest. I'm assuming he means muscular. And as the field had recently been tilled, he found enormous footprints, 4 to 5 inches in diameter. Now, these are just some of the many sightings of, Bray Road. There are literally dozens upon dozens upon dozens of them. But these are just a few of them. Here's the interesting thing, and I think this is something, if you're going to talk about the subject, you probably should know as well. There was a documentary that came out in the late 80s, early 90s, and it was called The Beast of Bray Road. It was a piece of supposed video footage of this guy in the 1970s, and he's like fixing his car and playing with his car and his truck and what have you. And like maybe his girlfriend or his wife was videotaping the whole thing, and he's kind of acting up, hamming for the camera. And then from behind him comes this large creature, this large wolf-like creature, at first on all fours, and then it rises up. You see it coming. You hear the girlfriend or the person who's filming yelling. You see him turn. You see the running, all of this stuff. And then the camera goes bouncing. It kind of is sort of like the Blair Witch. It's not a professionally done thing. It's very grainy and very jumpy, but you can very clearly make this out. So for a long time, this was used as part of the evidence for the Bray Road Beast. And then eventually this thing started making its rounds on TV, and the other sightings started getting talked about. And finally, the people who made the film came forward and said, look, we faked it. The whole thing. They went and got clothing from the 70s. They had a couple cars out there that were from the 70s. So they just filmed it in black and white in a vintage way. And I have to tell you, that was very disheartening for people who really had bought into that story. So I want to make sure that I say that there was fakery as well. But there is another story that comes off of that area, not necessarily Bray Road, but the same region, that I also found quite compelling. This story was put in the local newspaper, made it to the local news channel, and it was the story of an officer, a Fish and Game Commission officer, who had the very, to me, distasteful job of having to pick up roadkill.
Somebody's got to.
I know. So late at night, he would get out there and he would go driving along, and he would stop and pick up roadkill. And it was usually like, deer and larger things that would cause an accident if somebody hit them on the road. He wasn't so interested in rabbits, but he didn't want that buck laying there for somebody at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning going to work to ram into. So he had a platform on the back of his SUV, and he had a winch on it so he could winch these dead animals up onto that platform and then tie them down. And then when he'd get a load, he would go back and deposit them wherever they deposited them and go back out and do it again. So it's the middle of the night. He sees this deer laying on the road. It's smattered everywhere. Gets out. He hooks it up, winches it up onto the platform, gets back in the vehicle. And before he leaves, because he's pulled off to the side of the road now, he's writing up his paperwork for it, because apparently you have to document where you got it and what have you. So he's sitting there in the truck writing this all up when all of a sudden he feels the car shift, and he hears a creaking as though something's just jumped onto the back of the vehicle or the platform. He looks into the rearview mirror and he claims he saw a huge wolf-like man, and it was trying to pull the deer off the platform. He's, kind of panicked. He doesn't know what to do. And whatever this thing was, it was strong enough that when it couldn't get it untied, because of how he had tied it down, it literally wrenched the platform off the vehicle. And when that happened, he's out of there. So he goes out, he calls for backup, he comes back in with these people, and there is the platform all kind of bent a little bit, and the pieces of the deer that were not torn off, and whatever it was, it carried away the main carcass. And he was adamant that this thing was a bipedal wolf. So, I mean, those are a lot of compelling stories in that one spot. Now, Pennsylvania has had some stories. We're from Pennsylvania, so I always tell a few extra Pennsylvania stories for our guys. So I came across this story that took place in the mid 1800s. The story is about a young lady whose job was to tend the sheep on her family's farm. So she would go up into the mountain meadows, and there was like this little rude hut up there she would stay in for the summer, and go down every so often and get provisions and what have you. But she'd stay up there where the sheep could eat and graze. That way they didn't graze off the lowland where they would need to have it for late fall and early winter. That's one of the reasons that they would take them so far away in the summer months, early summer. Well, there was this old guy in the area, and he would come up and sit and talk to her. She was very nice to him. He was kind of an outcast, and a lot of people would chase him off their land, and there were lots of nasty stories about this poor old guy. He was poor and, pretty much homeless and what have you. But she was always very nice to him. And if he would come, she would have wrapped up a biscuit or something in a hanky, and she would save it for him. And he would come and sit with her and talk to her, and she would give him part of her meal, whatever she had saved for him that day. Well, throughout that spring and summer, everybody was losing sheep except her. And people began to comment about, there's something kind of funny about the fact that all of us have lost some of our sheep to this big old grizzled wolf, except for her. Well, the one day she's moving the sheep, and she hears this commotion. There's this wolf running toward her. It was this huge old kind of gray wolf. You could tell he was kind of old. He was just, from the way he looked, he was kind of ratty looking. And these guys are coming behind him, these farmers, and they've got guns, and they're shooting and yelling, and he's headed in her direction, and she doesn't really know what to do. I mean, she's like a 14, 15-year-old girl, and how does she get her sheep out of the way, and what's going on? And, and she doesn't want to get attacked by the wolf either. So she's just sort of standing there petrified, and the wolf kind of bypasses her, kind of glancingly hits her, and then staggers off, and at that point, he's hit with a bullet. And because she had sort of slowed him down a hair. And instead of a wolf laying there was the old man. And she was horrified, but she's like, oh my God. And he said, run. Don't let them see me talking to you. I'm done for. But bless you, young lady. And then farmers come and they kill him. And it was believed that he was a werewolf, and he was killing for the people that were rude to him and nasty to him, he took some of their sheep. But because this young lady was kind, he would guard her sheep and spare her sheep from being killed.
Interesting. I mean, that would show presence of mind even in the state of being a wolf.
Yes, and a compassion can touch some.
But I can just see when you're describing, though, and I mean the stories and everything else, the wolf changing back into a person. All I can see is Lon Chaney Jr. laying there.
And it's kind of bizarre, but this story has been well known in Pennsylvania. I mean, amongst folklorists and stuff for a long time. It's rather singular. There's not a ton of them. Like I said, there's the Erie Indian story of the Black Panther Man. And then there's these red-eyed werewolves that appeared in 1973. So for those who don't know, in Pennsylvania, 1973 and 1974 was a field day for cryptozoologists and UFO people. Literally, there were sightings all the time It was going on weekly. The police were literally calling paranormal researcher Stan Gordon, and he was getting calls from state police officers going, "This is going on, and this is going on, and oh my God, I don't know what this is," and blah blah blah. So here's one of Stan's cases. This was in 1973. It was the fall. There were, in the witnesses' words, these large creatures with red fire eyes that glowed in the darkness. They were about 8 foot tall, and they gave off a terrible stench. There was another one that was seen that was about 6 feet tall. And again, it looked like an extremely muscular man with large, long, thick fur. This could have been this sighting gets quoted as for werewolves. It gets quoted for Bigfoot. So I'm not sure, but the arms were very long. They hung down past the knees. It had the agility of a deer. It had footprints that were between 52 and 57 inches. And there were no indication of odors, which is interesting because most Bigfoots come with a terrible rank smell. And this thing was seen very shortly, these things were seen very shortly after there had been a UFO sighting in this place. And it doesn't say it here, but let me tell you, the people that reported this were Amish.
Well, they didn't. Yeah, they didn't phone it in.
Well, actually, in a way they did, because it was so terrifying what was going on the farm that one of them decided to walk to a neighbor's house and ask if he would call the police so the police could come and talk to them. And I mean, that takes a little bit of commitment to your storyline, particularly if you're Amish and you don't want that stigma and attention. This is not something you hear much from the Amish. So that was a compelling component of it. It was seen by the farmer. It was seen by his adult son. It was seen by 2 teenage boys who were neighbors. It was seen by the first 2 state cops who came, then by a 3rd state cop who came later, then by Stan and I think 2 or 3 of his researchers. I know at least 2. Over the course of about 3 days and nights. So that's a rather compelling story because you've got multiple witnesses, some of them state cops, who were willing to call a paranormal researcher and get help because they couldn't handle what was going on.
Interesting. And the location was what again?
Lancaster County.
Okay. All right. Yeah, definitely heart of Amish country.
Yeah. And you have to wonder, I mean, it took some moxie for that man to decide to call the police. That is not something that as a normal, we live in an area where there's many Amish and Mennonites. I have friends who are Amish, and that is not something that under normal circumstances they would do. So this was an extraordinary story. And then when the state cops came to investigate, they saw it. So then they said, hey, well, there was this guy that left a card, and they went back and got the card and called Stan Gordon, and he got his team gathered up, and they went to Lancaster County. So I just think that it's a fascinating subject. There are thousands of these stories. Not all of them can be mental health issues. Not all of them are Bigfoot. If you take all of it and distill it down, and there's 10%, just 10%, that you cannot explain away from misidentifications, people who want attention, mental health issues, pranks and practical jokes. If there's 10% left, even 5%, something's still going on in these woods and have been going on all around the world since earliest written times, and some places even before the first written times when stories were passed along orally. So, that's what I wanted to share tonight. I was thinking about werewolves. I find it fascinating. And I just, as I was reading through some stuff the other week, and I saw, there's so many coincidences in all of this. So what's out there? And is it what we now call the Bigfoot? Is that the same thing, or is it some other fellow creature? Is that part of what the Dogman stories are really about? Different cultures, different times. We may change a little bit of the vernacular, but at the end of the day, it still boils down to a large creature that's part human, part animal, and very well might have intellect and even compassion, if we judge from the story of the young lady with the sheeps.
Well, the interesting thing here, though, is that Bigfoot and other cryptids are not part-time humans.
Yes, that's true.
or even dogmen or mothmen, for example.
Right.
Not part-time humans. I think in all the stories you've recalled, only werewolves fit that bill.
Yep, they are singular. The only other creature that is part human and part something else would be a vampire.
But then they're always a vampire, according to.
They are, but they do also exhibit the ability to have compassion and cunning. But they are always a vampire. Well, they're always an undead, and they're hungry for their blood often overshadows them, but not always. There are weird stories where they turn away from their own need to protect somebody they like, or because they're enjoying a conversation or whatever. So they're fascinating. And again, that's another creature of the night that you find in some form in every culture. We'll go into some vampire stories one of these days. I have a good friend who very well could have encountered one. She actually believes she did. And whenever I tell you, you should put a little bit of stock in this lady. This lady has, I believe, 3 PhDs in psychology. She is a forensic psychologist and one of the foremost experts in the country on serial killers. This is a savvy lady. This is not somebody who's superstitious. She tears everything apart to figure it out. But we'll save that story for another day.
All right. Fair enough.
So I hope everybody enjoyed these stories tonight and that they'll come visit us again. We'll try to get things moving forward again. But like I said, every so often in life, you just got to stop a little bit and get caught up with other things.
Yeah, that's it. All of us have to we got to keep the lights on. So that's, if you have enjoyed this video or audio, depending on how you're listening, please click the like button on YouTube. If you can, please click the subscribe button. If you're interested in our content and you want to hear more of it, then also click that bell and you'll get notified whenever we release new content. We will try to do that as quickly as possible. And we have a Facebook page. It's the Paranormalist Podcast. Again, the YouTube channel, also the Paranormalist Podcast, and the email address where you can contact us with stories, other ideas, feedback, things like that is paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com.
Yes, and there's been a couple people who've contacted me through my other email from my Piney Creek Press, and I wanted to let them know that I did get their emails, and I will be in touch with you. Again, this past month's been a really busy one. So bear with us, but yes, I would love to hear your stories. And if you have stories to share, please reach out to us.
Oh, please do. Yes, I love to hear them.
So do I.
Why do you suppose I'm doing this?
Why do you think I do this? I have so many, I have to tell you, I'm never more disappointed than when I see a book like on Amazon or something and I start reading the description and then I get down to author and I'm like, crap, it's my book. No wonder it all sounded familiar. Ah, crap. I thought I had a good book to read. So yeah, I got it. Like, come on, guys, give me some stories for a change. I love your tales. They're awesome.
I enjoy hearing them before everybody else does.
And you do. You always do.
Yeah. All right, Patty. Well, thank you again. And hopefully we will resume a more regular schedule.
Yes.
And until next time.
Good night.